Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and today we're going to talk about some wild game. Drew, what do you got for us on this terrestrial episode?
Well, you know, it's hunting season, so I've for a lot of different species, it's hunting season, so I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of talk about some food safety stuff and properly handling critters after we harvest them and those sorts of things so that the meat has good flavor, so that we're not running the risk of getting ourselves sick from handling that meat and then eating it later and those sorts of things.
Yeah, you know, it's finally getting chilly enough where I feel like it's hunting season. It's been archery season for a couple months by now. But it, when it's warmer out there, it's always hard for me to want to go hunt, especially a larger animal. I get concerned, and I don't know how practical it is to worry about this stuff, but I do worry about the quality of the meat once we harvest that animal. So I'm excited about this topic today.
Good.
But when we're talking about harvest, when does harvest start? Is it part of the whole hunting process? Is it when we fire the bow or the gun? When what is harvest, I guess? When does that start?
Well, I guess it's probably part of the whole process of hunting if you want to think about it holistically. But, I think what we're going to talk about here is mostly once you have pulled the trigger or released an arrow and that animal expires, then what do we do after that? And that's sort of the beginning of the process of turning that critter into meat or something that we can use. So.
Yeah, that process of going from an animal to dehyde it or taking the hide off or the pelt off the animal and watching it transform into meat. There's not one point in that process that I can identify. When you put it in the cooler, obviously it's meat, but that transition I think is really important to understand. It's one of the parts of hunting that I enjoy most, is being able to see kind of that process. But before we get to that point, when we harvest that animal, what are some of the first things we need to do, once we have that animal has expired?
Sure. So, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you're following the laws and regulations of the state that you're in where you harvest that animal, right? So where we are in Kansas, it's illegal to move a big game animal that you've harvested without tagging it. So in our state, we were fortunate, I think, to have an electronic tagging system that allows us to just open up an app on our phone, take a picture of that critter, include some information about, what method of take we used, what county you were in, maybe what unit you were in if you're harvesting deer, the sex, the species, method of take, and all that kind of stuff. And then you can do whatever you want with that critter from a processing standpoint. So that's important. In some states, even on a big game animal, you might have to leave proof of sex on at least 1/4 of that animal. So I harvested an elk in Colorado a few years ago, and one of the things that surprised me was I couldn't completely break that down into prepared meat before I brought it back to Kansas. I had to on that cow elk, I had to leave the vagina attached to one of the quarters, and that was the proof of sex that had to be there to bring it home. So make sure you know the regulations about those things in the state you're in.
Yeah, when I was growing up, that rings true to me, because when I was growing up, my dad and I went on a fishing trip up to Canada, crossed the border, and we had some good luck on that trip, and we were bringing back a lot of meat, but the regulations say you need to leave an inch strip of the skin on so that they can tell the species of the fish. And when we got to the border, we didn't have that. We had just filleted all the fish, and they let us know very clearly that was not acceptable.
Yeah.
And my dad still won't go back on fishing trips to Canada because it was so traumatic. But I think that's they're not just doing that to be malicious or to be
Right.
mean. There's a lot of, wildlife management and understanding the harvest that they're trying to protect. So there are a lot of good reasons that those regulations are in place.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And for species like waterfowl, you leave a wing on, and that shows both species and sex.
Yeah.
And so it's an important part of making regulations enforceable, right? Having some sort of tagging system that shows that critter is actually an animal that was legally harvested.
Right.
Yeah.
So once we have harvested that animal, we've tagged that animal, what are some of the first things we need to be thinking about when we're processing or starting to process that animal?
Sure. So, one of the most important things is getting that critter cooled down as quickly as possible. And there's lots of different ways that we can go about doing that. If we're thinking about a big game animal, we talk about field dressing a lot. And so that's just removing the viscera, which another way to say that is just getting the guts out, right? And those guts retain a lot of heat. And so they can allow the bacterial action to continue for a much longer period of time in that animal. They also contain a lot of bacteria. And so that combination of retaining heat, including bacteria, can lead to spoilage if that's kept in there. For smaller critters, we don't necessarily think about this a lot, right? If we're out spending a whole day quail hunting, or if we're out spending a whole day dove hunting or pheasant hunting or something like that, if the temperature's warm, we also need to get those critters cooled down. One way to do that might be to, every time you take a break, just going ahead and doing what you can to dress those animals that you've harvested up to that point. Maybe get them in ice on a cooler or something like that, but allow that cooling process to start. Remove those guts that contain all that bacteria. That's an important thing, but make sure you're following the regulations that are associated with that.
Yeah, one of the things that we think about a lot, especially with archery hunting, is you don't necessarily want to release that arrow and hit that animal and then jump out of your stand and go chase them.
Yeah.
You want to give them time to expire. How do you balance kind of making sure you're doing the right thing with the post harvest and also making sure you're doing the right thing with the harvest of that animal to start with?
Yeah. So if you've made a well placed shot, then that animal should expire within 20 or 30 minutes, right? And so, if you're staying in a stand after you've released an arrow and kind of watched where that animal's gone, if you're staying up there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, you're probably giving it long enough, unless you know that you made a poor shot. So shot placement is another important thing to think about when we're trying to do a good job of ethically harvesting animals and also preserving that meat to the best that we can, because if we make a shot that's back in that gut cavity, then that spills gut contents inside of that animal. That may lead to additional spoilage that we wouldn't see if we'd have made a different sort of shot that might be more efficient at leading to that animal expiring quickly. And so I guess that's the other side of good shot placement too, is we don't want animals to suffer. And we also want to give ourselves the best possibility of recovering that animal that we have harvested. And so make those good shots.
Yeah, planning ahead of time can have impacts on how the meat tastes, long term there for sure. So, you mentioned you're not allowed to move big game in Kansas until it's been tagged and stuff. Are you allowed to prepare it when it's in the field then? Are you allowed to, take the viscera out, or do you need to move it somewhere else?
So you can, in our state with the electronic tagging process, you can fully debone that meat. When I go out deer hunting, unless I'm on public land, I try to be able to drive to the critters that I harvest. And so, I'm going to make a shot. I'm going to find that animal. I'm going to tag it, and then I'm going to immediately go get my vehicle, and I'm going to come back to that animal, and it's going to be deboned, wrapped meat in a cooler full of ice when I leave that property.
Oh wow!
And for me, that is an efficient way to minimize how much stuff I have to dispose of. after I get home. It's also a way not to move around parts and pieces of that animal that I don't have to, that might lead to disease spread. When we think about chronic wasting disease, the main way that's spread a long ways, not a few miles, but the main way it's spread to different regions is by folks moving around parts and pieces of harvested animals. And so if I'm not moving things that I don't have to, then that helps minimize that. But getting that animal deboned and into a cooler quickly, it really eliminates spoilage unless I don't do what I'm supposed to do with that meat once I get it home, right? And it minimizes me having to deal with stuff later on. And I really didn't start to do that until I moved to town. I used to deer hunt about a mile from my house. and when I lived in the country and deer hunted that close to my house, as soon as I harvested an animal, I'd load it up, I'd take it home, I'd hang it up, and I'd process them the way that a lot of people do, by taking the guts out first and all that sort of thing. But learning how to process, or at least debone in the field, and do that following sort of what people call the gutless method. Yeah, it's really, really increased my efficiency as a processor of animals, and I think I do a better job of keeping the meat clean and those sorts of things as well, because I'm not getting into that gut cavity until really the very last step when I'm going in there to get those tenderloins out. Right. And so I'm not spilling gut contents on parts of meat that they don't need to contact and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I used to, when I was really young, probably like a lot of us did. You harvest something and you want to show it off to everyone, so you throw it in the pickup truck and you drive around town and you show everyone the deer you harvested, and then you might get around to processing that later that day or the next day or whatever. It doesn't really matter when you're younger, as much, to me at least, right? But now once you start processing meat quickly, it really does change the flavor, and it changes the enjoyment of eating that venison or whatever the large game you're eating. So I think that the processing side of things is it just really is neat to me. And going from an animal that you were watching take its last steps to harvesting that animal, and then watching that process where it becomes less of an animal and more of meat. Not that they're separated, but that process, sure, I think, is really important for us to understand. And in our society especially, if you ask kids now where chicken nuggets come from, they say McDonald's, and so that connection back to the meat is coming from the animal. And as a hunting community, I think that, we really value and respect that. So it's just that whole part of it it's a fun part of hunting, I think, if you can get into it. And the first couple times, that you're processing an animal, it's overwhelming. Sure. But at, the worst case scenario, you have a bunch of big pieces that are roast and a bunch of little pieces you grind up. And if it's not really a roast and you're calling it a roast, no one's probably going to know.
Yeah, that's okay.
And so it's okay. But I think that whole process is a lot of fun. So what are some things while we are processing, are there indicators that maybe we need to stay away from certain portions of meat, or, are there times maybe we shouldn't eat that animal? What are we allowed to not eat an animal if it shows signs of issues? What are some thoughts there?
Yeah. So one of the things, just to backtrack a little bit, I think it's important to say that it's all of the things that we're talking about apply whether you're going to butcher the meat yourself or if you're going to take it to a meat processor to butcher it for you. It's still it's still important to get the guts out as quickly as you can so that meat has time to cool off. It may be even more important to field dress a big game animal quickly before you take it to a meat processor, because it might have to wait around until tomorrow before it gets dealt with much more. So that part is important. It's also it's very reasonable not to have time or not to have the want to butcher that animal yourself. Sure. Too, and that doesn't take away from the experience or anything like that.
Yeah, very good point. If we are taking it in, are there things do we need to cool down that meat, or is getting the guts out enough and then taking it in? What are the steps to do that properly?
I think it depends on how quickly you can get it there.
Yeah.
If we harvest an animal of an evening, or let's say it's the morning, we harvest an animal, we field dress it, and we get it in the pickup, and we go straight to the meat processor. That's probably, we don't need to do anything else. They're going to take care of everything else. If we harvest an animal and field dress it, and it's late at night, and we can't get it to the processor until tomorrow, then getting that animal cool however we can is going to be important. And so, if it's possible for you to hang it in a cold place, then that's great. If it's warm, if it's more than 40 degrees outside at night and you're not going to be able to take it in until tomorrow, then going ahead and getting it field dressed and then packing that gut cavity with ice, that will allow that meat to cool down much more. And this is not something that I would recommend to folks, but, sometimes I do processing workshops, and I have been in the situation where I was afraid I wasn't going to have a deer to process 30 minutes before the program was supposed to start. And magically the deer walked out and everything worked out. And so I've started harvesting deer for those processing workshops in the morning before that workshop that might not be until 6:30 at night or something like that. And what I've learned to kind of do there is park my pickup in the shade somewhere and get ice on the carcass. I lay the carcass on its back. And that I said that backwards. I get the carcass on its belly, so that any juices that start to come out of the guts as that bacteria start working really hard in there with all that warmth and everything goes away from the bulk of the meat rather than towards the bulk of the meat. And that's an important thing if we're harvesting fur bearers too, because a lot of times we might run traps in the morning before work, but then we can't skin those fur-bearing animals until the evening. And so if we can go ahead and put those critters on their belly, then we might see less spoilage. The flip side of that is if you're dealing with an animal where some of the valuable fur is on the belly, then and this applies if all we care about is the fur and not the meat, right? And so all the body that's in between the gut cavity and the back is going to reduce how much of that bacteria gets to the fur. So beaver, bobcats, coyotes, those sorts of critters, have them laying on their back if you can't process them until that evening if we harvest them that morning. But whatever you can do to get it cooled off as quickly as possible and keep it cool until you're going to process it.
Are there times that, that we get up to the animal and maybe the meat looks like it shouldn't be eaten? What are some signs that maybe we should think about not eating that animal once we've harvested? And are you allowed to do that?
So it's not recommended that we eat sick animals.
Yeah.
And so how do you know an animal's sick? Right. The things that we tend to look for are potentially, if we're deer hunting, if an animal is exhibiting very weird behavior, if a buck allows you to walk up to it and it doesn't run away, then that animal's probably sick. There's probably something wrong with it. If we see strange lesions or big sores either on the outside of that animal or on the inside of that animal, if we see blood coming from places where we wouldn't expect it to, like the anus or from the nostrils, if we didn't shoot it in a way that would cause that to happen, those sorts of things are important. Weird discharges, those could be odd looking, like green mucus or pus and those sorts of things. All those can be signs that an animal is sick. One of the things that we see quite a bit in white-tailed deer are these brain abscesses. And a lot of times that brain abscess is caused by the fact that antlers put an incredible amount of leverage on all the bones that make up the skull. And if you haven't spent much time looking at a mammal skull that's been cleaned up, it might be hard to wrap your head around this, but like our skulls, all mammal skulls are formed of a whole bunch of different bones that ossify or fuse together and become basically one large bone. And the leverage that those antlers put on all those different sutures, or where those bones come together, can cause them to separate, or they can cause breakage when those bucks are fighting. And so that opening of the skull can allow bacteria to get in there and create an infection. And so it's not uncommon to have these weird acting bucks that will allow you to walk up to them, or that maybe they're walking in circles, or they allow maybe they just walk right out in front of a vehicle that they shouldn't have, and they get hit. Well, you look at where that antler is emerging from the skull, and you'll see this green nasty pus. And what that typically is that brain abscess that we're talking about. And those animals, a lot of times, are not. There's not a problem with eating them, but if they're sick, it's not good to eat them, because unless you're sure that that's what's going on, and that's why I'm saying that, I guess. But are we allowed to not eat an animal that we have taken? It was part of your question, and broadly that falls under wanton waste. And different states probably have different laws about this. In Kansas, it's not legal to take a game animal and then leave it in the field without doing anything with it. An exception to that would be if you harvested a sick deer. If you harvested a sick animal, it's not recommended that you eat that, but you actually should tag that animal because you killed that animal, and it's a big game animal, and for that to be legal, you would need to put your tag on it. What is not legal would be to go out and shoot a deer and cut its head off and just take that trophy back, right? Leaving the body out there, not utilizing the meat, that sort of thing, that would fall under wanton waste.
Yeah. Or just the back straps would be another common example.
Yeah, exactly. But if we've got a legitimate reason for leaving that animal be because it's sick, then that's different.
So as we're thinking about, all these potential illnesses or something, is it possible for those to spread to people, or what? And what can we do to make sure that we're protecting ourselves in those situations while we process the animal?
Sure. So there's diseases that we call zoonotic diseases, and zoonotic diseases are diseases that can be passed from animals to people, or from animals to humans, and then from humans back to animals. And there's lots and lots of different zoonotic diseases. If we're thinking about trying to protect ourselves from transmission of those diseases when we're handling animals, wearing exam gloves, nitrile gloves, latex gloves, those sorts of things when we're processing them is important. I'm probably the world's worst example of that. I grew up trapping and skinning coyotes and raccoons and bobcats and stuff, and I never wore gloves when I was doing that. And I don't ever think about it when I'm processing deer. And that's something that I'm going to try to do better at.
It makes cleanup a lot easier when you go wash your hands at the end.
Yeah, it does for sure. And the other thing about that too is, at least wear gloves while you're handling the guts, because that's where a lot of these things that we're concerned about are. And then we're not handling meat with our same hands that we've touched the viscera with, where a lot of those harmful bacteria might be, and so that also helps us keep from contaminating the meat potentially. So that's important. After we handle a critter, after we process a critter, washing our hands is important, especially before you eat, especially before you pick your nose, especially before you go to the bathroom and those sorts of things. There's lots of different routes that pathogens can enter our body, and washing our hands so that we can prevent that's important. There's when we're talking about getting blood or rumen contents and all those sorts of things off of our hands, that can be difficult in the field. Something that works really well, the like mechanics or the wipes that are designed to be degreasing wipes for mechanics are very, very good. So you can use those wipes to get all the grime off your hands. And then the pre-moistened disinfectant wipes are good as well to use after that to kill any bacteria, viruses, other pathogens that might still be on your hands. Hand sanitizer is good, but hand sanitizer may not do very much if you've got layers of goop on your hands from all the blood and everything that you've handled. It may become diluted by that stuff. It may not get down to your skin. The other thing to be aware of with hand sanitizer is that it's going to be most effective if it can dry on your hands. And so if our hands are wet, we're going to dilute that alcohol that's the active ingredient in the hand sanitizer, and it may not be as effective as it could be. But that's kind of how I would think about it. Get the junk off, and then get a disinfectant on there.
What about the meat itself once we've processed it? So, obviously being clean while we're processing,
Yeah.
but if I take out a roast from my freezer, can that give me a disease? Can I get sick from that?
Yes and no. I mean, what we're trying to do is limit the possibility of getting sick, right? Because even when we go buy meat from the grocery store, there's potential that you could get a disease from that meat, and so we're trying to minimize that potential. And so if we are as clean as we can be when we handle that meat, if we do not let it sit out for a long time to thaw and become warm enough that we have new bacterial action in there and those sorts of things, all of those things are going to minimize it. We also need to think about cooking temperatures and that sort of thing. So most of the pathogens that we can get from eating meat, not all of them, but most of them are killed by normal cooking temperatures. The thing to be aware of is that medium rare might not be enough. So pretty well any bacteria or virus that we're concerned about being zoonotic, 160, 165 degrees, somewhere in there is going to kill those critters, and we don't have to worry about getting sick from them. The other side of that is if you look really closely, you may not have to get it to 165 if you get it to a certain temperature for a longer period of time. But those lower temperatures for longer periods of time are going to be specific to the different species of pathogens that you're thinking about. So if you want to broadly make sure you're safe, 165 is a good temperature to think about.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is more for my brain. I just want to say it out loud, but we've been thinking about, venison a lot, at least while we've been talking about this. Yeah. And, if you're eating something, yellow grubs are really common in fish fillets, and they look unsightly, but they're not going to pass on. But, there are certain types of parasites especially that can get in that meat and pass along. And I know that with, I don't know with venison necessarily, but I know with some of the other species, raccoons are a common one that I know you really need to cook to a really high temperature. Are there examples that you know of on the terrestrial side that maybe we need to be aware of aside from just venison or something?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of different bacteria. Salmonella is one that we are concerned about with food from the grocery store. Pretty much all the critters that we're going to harvest and eat on the terrestrial side of things are potential reservoirs for salmonella, and we could get salmonella from. Yeah. And that's definitely not one that's very fun to have. So that's something to have in the back of your mind. Leptospirosis is another one that most mammals can carry and transmit, and that's one that you can actually get from urine. So it's a little different one to think about, but that bacteria can absorb through your skin and urine. Campylobacter is an example that we think about with birds. Listeria is also another example that we think about birds, and we hear about listeria outbreaks associated with chicken and that sort of thing. Well, if you're a quail hunter, if you're a waterfowl hunter, that's one to think about there. We don't think about this in Kansas, but brucellosis, if we're harvesting elk near the greater Yellowstone area, that's a concern there, and that's definitely not one that we want to get if we're humans. Tularemia is a real common one. That used to be thought rabbit fever. Is what most people would probably know about that, but it's common in mammals, and especially lagomorphs, which that'd be your rabbits and hares, and also other rodents, so beaver. But tularemia can be in raccoons and some of those other critters too. So that's bacteria, and I know your question was what critters do we have to think about, but we might as well talk about the different kind of pathogens that there are too. So viruses are another kind of pathogen too, and so some examples of viruses that are zoonotic would be rabies. We've done a really good job of managing rabies transmission to humans in the United States by vaccinating our pets. So we don't see near as much of that as some countries do. But that's still a concern. And that's another one of those things. If you're hunting animals that are sick, don't eat those sick animals, because that's one of them out there. Hantavirus, that's not one that people would commonly get from meat, but if you're in the desert Southwest, that's definitely one that folks encounter in cabins. So it's not necessarily associated with the animals that they harvest, but if we're in remote hunting cabins, and let's say we walk into a cabin in an arid area and there's lots of feces accumulation from mice and rats in there. The main way that people get hantavirus is by going into an enclosed space like that and then sweeping up those droppings. And something about that combination of dust in the air irritating the lungs and breathing in those viral particles is sort of how that's transmitted to people. So that's an important one. Avian influenza, we've talked about that a lot recently in the last few years, right? So waterfowl move that all over the country. Coronaviruses, I know everybody's sick and tired of talking about COVID. During the pandemic, one of the things that biologists discovered by sampling lots and lots of different critters is that white-tailed deer are in some places infected at pretty high rates by COVID. And when that came out, a lot of people had a pretty negative reaction to that, just that information being put out, because I think sometimes we have this idea that information like that is put out to try and change our behavior from, to get us not to hunt anymore or something like that. And that absolutely is not the point of us knowing that white-tailed deer can be an important reservoir for COVID. It's actually understanding that, if that virus gets into white-tailed deer and it's transmitted among deer and they aren't really affected by it all that much, it doesn't kill them, it doesn't shorten their lifespan, then that virus can sit in those critters and mutate, right? And then those mutations, if that new mutated virus is transmitted back to humans, then it can have different characteristics than what that disease had before. And so I think the important thing for us to understand about that is that, number one, it's an important way that the disease can mutate. But if you are a person who's immunocompromised, who might be at high risk of, having an adverse reaction to a COVID-19 infection, then take extra precautions when you're out there handling deer.
Sure.
Right? And it sounds goofy, but maybe it makes sense to wear a mask when you're doing that. Put gloves on, all those sorts of things while you're handling that critter. Norovirus, that's a nasty one, but that's mostly outside the U.S. Part of the reason that I kind of was prompted to put this together was last month there was a lot of information about hemorrhagic disease. in white-tailed deer. And so hemorrhagic disease refers to blue tongue, which is a virus that deer can have, also that can get into cattle, and then also epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which most people just call EHD. These are diseases that are typically either associated with drought or really wet weather. And that's because the midges that spread them to the deer are breeding in exposed mud flats. And so if deer are coming to drink and they're encountering these areas with lots of mud flats and they're bitten by these midges, then we can see pretty high transmission of that disease. And in the Great Plains, most of the Midwest, EHD can be very, very lethal and can kill a lot of deer. And so we might see a lot of dead deer. In other areas of the U.S., maybe where the disease has been longer, there seems to be more resistance and it's not as lethal. It's not something that we know of to be transmissible to humans.
Yeah.
It can pass to livestock, but it typically doesn't really affect cattle very much. They can be infected, but they're not affected.
Sure.
Is kind of the way people talk about that. But don't eat sick deer. don't eat sick wildlife because you might not know what it has, right? And typically a deer with EHD is going to be pretty nasty looking. It's going to be lethargic. It's going to be very, very skinny and those sorts of things. So that's something that's easy to avoid. You mentioned parasites. Raccoon roundworm is a really nasty one. Most human infections of raccoon roundworm come from ingesting feces from raccoons, and of course that's not something that most people do, right? But the eggs from raccoon roundworm can insist in meat and those sorts of things. And so, if you eat raccoons, then it's important to think about cleaning them. When you're gutting raccoons, you definitely would want to wear gloves because raccoon roundworm is something that is just sort of a normal infection in raccoons. It's not very adverse for them. But if a human infection is typically really, really bad. Those larvae perforate the walls of your intestines, and then they go somewhere in your body to become an adult worm. And two of the common places that they do that are either your eye or your brain. And
none of those sound pleasant.
No. So yeah, if you get a roundworm larva in your eye, it's going to turn into adult and sprout out your eye, and you're probably going to go blind. If it goes into your brain, then you're going to be like the guy in the Pink Floyd song where the worms eat into his brain, and you'd get encephalitis and probably die from it. So that wouldn't be good.
No, that does not sound very good.
Yeah, Giardia, that's another example of a parasite. People call that beaver fever. It's a protozoan that they shed in their feces. It tends to not, I don't think, be something that really bothers beaver all that much because it seems like most of the water that they live in has that protozoan in it, but it causes really, really bad intestinal distress in humans. So that's one that we don't want. Tapeworms are another example. You don't eat raw grasshoppers because they might give you tapeworms, right? But if we're handling rabbits and those sorts of things, any mammal really could have worms of some kind living in its intestines.
Yeah.
So staying out of those intestines is important. Fungi are another kind of critter that infects humans and wildlife. We don't typically think about fungal infections as being something that we might acquire from game that we harvest. The exception to that would be that you could get ringworm from let's say a wild cat like a bobcat if it had those on its body, but that's really not a common thing that we think about. And then really the last pathogen type would be prions. And, we've talked about chronic wasting disease on this podcast before, but it's a prion, and it's a weird one, right? All these other things are living organisms. A prion is just a mutated strand of protein. And it is the one that normal cooking temperatures would not even come close to killing. And it's not even, killing is not the right term because it's not alive. It's a protein. It has to be denatured. And that temperature's up around 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So there wouldn't be much left.
Not much left at that temperature.
Yeah. And so that's why, we're thinking about if you're in a CWD zone, potentially getting that meat, or not the meat, but testing any deer that you harvest before you eat them, because we can't kill it by cooking them.
Sure.
So.
Well, that's a lot of good reasons to process meat correctly there you just mentioned. I think also, so there's the food safety standpoint, right? But I also think, all of this stuff is going to impact, at the end of the day, the enjoyment of that meat that we get from those animals, right? So in addition to all those great reasons, we don't want to get sick. Does it change the quality of the meat at the end of the day?
Sure. If you don't get that critter cooled off very quickly, you're going to have some of that bacterial action seep into the meat, and it could seep into the meat that's quite a ways from the guts.
Yeah.
If you wait too long, and so that's going to affect the flavor. Getting it cooled off as quickly as possible is going to improve the flavor of the meat over letting it get warm and start to decompose and all those sorts of things. So that's a really important part of respecting that animal and getting the most good out of it as you can. A lot of times, gamey flavor is associated with poor handling.
Yeah.
And that starts at the field dressing process, and it really finishes with the final preparation before we either wrap the meat and label it and put it in the freezer, or before it hits the table. So, like deer fat doesn't taste very good, and a lot of the gamey flavor that's associated with especially whitetail deer is just not taking the time to trim the fat before we cook it. Beaver is very, very good meat, but if you cook a beaver with all the fat on it, it's going to taste like how a beaver smells. So that's just another example of remove the fat. Cut the meat in an appropriate way. That might not be something that people always think about, but when you're cutting meat, cut it across the grain. Don't cut it with the grain, because it's going to be a whole lot more tender. Allowing the meat to relax after that animal has expired will drastically improve the palatability of that meat. It's going to be a whole lot tougher if we take a backstrap straight off an animal and eat it today than it would be if we allowed that to cool and relax and prepare it tomorrow. So lots and lots of different things like that to think about.
Yeah, lots of good information to think about when we're processing animals. And I think at the end of the day, what are some things? There's a lot of scary things you've talked about here, but what are some of the main takeaways that you have from this episode here?
Sure. So all of that said, you still have to be practical, and you don't want to be scared of the critters that you harvest, right? So we're thinking about minimizing exposure, not just exposure to ourselves, but also exposure to the meat of these different critters that could be living inside the critter that we harvest. So get them processed as quickly as possible. Field dress, get that critter cool. Do the final processing as quickly as we can. Make good shots. Try not to spill gut contents or bladder contents on the meat. If you do, it's okay. Clean it up, wash it real good. But it's everybody who has processed their own animals has spilled some gut contents or spilled some urine on meat. You don't want it to sit there and have time to soak in and affect the flavor or infect it with other different things and those sorts of things. Protect yourself also. Wear gloves if you can. Do a good job of washing your hands. If you're going to process stuff in the field, including field dressing, it's a good idea to get you, and I'm going to say a brand, so it's probably something I'm not supposed to do, but it's one of the things that I have in my mind because, there's a product called Tub of Towels, and it's pretty easy to keep that tub of towels in your truck, and there's a gajillion other options like that, right?
Yeah.
That do a good job of removing all the junk from your hands, and then use some sort of disinfectant after that, because that gets the goo off, but it doesn't kill any critters that might be on your skin. And enjoy the animals that you harvest, because that's one of the lasting things from the harvest of that animal, right? Going hunting, that makes memories, but bringing food home is a very, very satisfying part of this whole process, and it's something I deeply enjoy.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners and us being outdoors people, definitely something we enjoy is being able to enjoy that meat for a long time after it's been harvested.
Sure. One thing I didn't mention in all that was make sure you cook it well.
Yeah.
Get to the cooking temperatures that you need to kill any pathogens that might be associated with that meat.
No carpaccio, no eating the raw hearts while we're out in the field and that kind of stuff.
I'm not going to.
Well, Drew, thanks for chatting with us today. Great topic. Getting me excited to get out in a deer stand and hopefully fill my freezer this fall. So I appreciate you bringing that to us today, and look forward to an aquatic episode in a couple weeks.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.